So Pinasottle and Finkel's research showed clearly that FBI-trained profilers are not consistently better at identifying the likely characteristics of an offender. And this ambiguity as to the superiority of FBI-trained profilers comes through in all the published accounts. On some dimensions, some profilers outperform relevant others, and on other dimensions they don't. So what alternative approaches exist that use the crime scene to infer something of the characteristics of the offender? Probably the most famous alternative approach is investigative psychology that emerged from David Kanter's work. Now, in terms of using the crime scene to tell us something about the offender, the aim of investigative psychology is much the same as that of the FBI's approach. Essentially, you want to be able to tell the investigating officers something about the characteristics of an offender from their actions while committing the crime. This will then allow investigators to narrow down their search of suspects. However, in contrast to the FBI's approach, investigative psychology attempts to identify these characteristics by analysing behaviour in a way that is independent of the psychological mechanisms that underpin it. That is, investigative psychology is not focused on identifying why the offender commits a crime. Instead, investigative psychology simply infers the characteristics of the offender from the known actions taken by the offender during the crime. With this approach, it is possible to statistically analyse larger data sets to break down crime scenes into their component parts, and then relate these components to distinct aspects of the offender. These analyses are then submitted for publication in peer-reviewed journals where other researchers critically evaluate whether the analyses have been conducted according to the appropriate research practices. Unlike the FBI's case-by-case approach, analysis of large data sets in this way allows more certainty in determining how often particular types of behaviour are seen in particular crimes. A good example of this approach is seen in an early analysis conducted by Salfati and Kanter that was published in 1999. Salfati and Kanter looked at 82 British cases of single perpetrator, single victim homicide crime scenes that had been solved. They were interested to see whether there would be a thematic structure to the actions that occurred at these crime scenes. So they coded the information in the police homicide files for the presence or absence of a range of variables which reflected actions by the offender on the victim, descriptions of behaviour carried out by the offender at the crime scene, characteristics of the offender and characteristics of the victim. Now, variables that occurred in more than 90% of cases or in less than 10% of cases were excluded as they were seen to be either too common or too rare to help the classification. Salfati and Kanter then analysed this data to detect the co-occurrence of each variable with each other variable. And this analysis allowed them to produce a visual representation of factors that frequently co-occurred and those which were very unlikely to co-occur in this type of crime. So, for example, Salfati and Kanter found that in these homicide cases, it was unusual to find a body facing up where property of value had been taken from the victim or the crime scene. Now, through this analysis, Salfati and Kanter identify 3 crime scene themes which reflect the role of aggression in the offence. The first of these is expressive impulsive, where the underlying aim of the aggression seems to be to hurt the victim. Instrumental opportunistic and instrumental cognitive is where the murder is a byproduct of other more dominant motives, such as a desire for objects. Now, of the 82 cases included in this analysis, 53 cases could be classified as showing a dominant impulsive, opportunistic or cognitive crime scene theme. And of these 53 cases, 21 followed an impulsive theme of homicide crime scene behaviour. So, an expressive impulsive crime scene comprised multiple stab wounds across the victim's body, many other types of wounds, bringing a weapon to the scene and using a weapon from the scene in amongst other behaviours. Now, contrast this with an instrumental cognitive crime scene where, for example, offenders attempted to hide their crime, either by committing it outside or disposing of the body outside, and by removing evidence from the crime scene. Now, as this analysis used solved cases, offender characteristics were known, and so it's possible to see which offender characteristics co-occurred with which crime scene behaviours. So, for example, someone whose crime scene was classified as expressive impulsive was statistically likely to have committed prior violent or sexual offences, prior damage to property offences, and or to have been previously married. Those classified as having instrumental cognitive crime scenes were statistically more likely to have served in the armed forces or had a prior prison sentence. So you can see how, as long as a perpetrator in any given case doesn't deviate from the typical behaviour determined by the analysis of data from this sample, this kind of information would allow for a more focused targeting of suspects. That is, if you have an expressive instrumental crime scene, then with all other things being equal, you should start your further investigations with those suspects who have prior charges for offences that suggest conflict with or against other people. The other notable aspect of the analysis of self-assay encounter is that the interactional behaviour of offenders while offending does not seem to deviate too far from their interactional behavioural style while not offending. Now, David Cantor, the chief proponent of investigative psychology, suggests that the way in which people interact with one another in their everyday lives is so well rehearsed and ingrained that it influences all of their interactions with others, including the way that they interact with the victim while they are offending. That is, there is coherence in their personal interactions. And interpersonal coherence is one of the factors in Cantor's 5-factor model for interpreting a crime scene, which aims to tell the investigators about the offender's past and present experiences in life. The second factor in this model is time and space considerations in the choice of where the crime or crimes took place. Crime scenes are rarely random. Offenders select the time and location of their offending for a reason. So investigators might be able to infer something about the offender based on their choices about when and where to offend. For example, Cantor proposed that if an offender is engaging in an offence where he needs to feel in control, then the offender is likely to do this in a place that is familiar to him, perhaps closer to his base, where he feels more comfortable, knowledgeable and in control of what goes on. Behaviour engaged in or not engaged in at the crime scene can also tell you valuable information about the offender's background. This may be as simple as an indication of the likely level of intelligence of the offender, but it may be more detailed. For example, an offender who uses a knife in a very specific or specialised way might have had training in their occupation to use the knife in that particular way. This behaviour will also give you insight into the offender's forensic awareness, and this is the third factor in Cantor's 5-factor model. Imagine, for example, that at a crime scene it was clear that the offender had made little effort to cover up or remove forensic evidence. This may suggest that they do not have much experience in offending because they are not trying to evade forensic evidence collection techniques. So this offender may have few or no prior convictions. And forensic awareness is closely related to the 4th factor of criminal career. This is the idea that offenders will behave relatively consistently in committing their crimes. So any previous offences committed by this offender will resemble the current offence. Criminal career also covers the idea that deviations or changes away from the pattern of previous offending may be in response to something that happened while this person was attempting to commit their crime. For example, an offender who has never drugged their victim before might drug their victims in future because a victim struggled in response to their attack. The final factor is criminal characteristics. This is the idea that you can use characteristics of the offence to match it to similar types of crime. Now, an obvious question here is how does this 5-factor approach help us figure out what kind of person might have committed the crime? Well, once you've considered the crime scene in light of the 5-factor model of offender experiences, you can then make inferences about the characteristics the offender might have. So this might include inferences about the offender's residential location, their domestic or their social characteristics, their personal characteristics, and their occupational or educational history. This means that once investigators have gathered information about the likely characteristics and experiences of the offender, they will have a description of the sort of individual who may have committed the crime. And this can help focus the investigation of the offence. Now, at this point, it might sound like investigative psychology is very similar to the FBI's criminal investigative analysis approach. Both seem to generate profiles of typical offenders, which, as we saw from the analysis of Pinizzotto and Finkel, causes problems when your offender is in the minority that is not typical. A key question then is, how is investigative psychology different? Well, while both criminal investigative analysis and investigative psychology both have involved the investigator making inferences about the offender's likely characteristics on the basis of the crime scene, the emphasis in each type of profile is distinct. Profiles generated by criminal investigative analysis tend to focus on an offender's characteristics and their likely motivation. In contrast, profiles generated by investigative psychology tend to focus on the offender's characteristics and information about the offender's likely location. Typically also, Cantor and colleagues' research uses larger sample sizes than the FBI and subjects the research underpinning their inferences to peer review. So Cantor and Allison in 2000 talk of an analysis of criminal actions from an objective, often statistical viewpoint, rather than one based on personal intuition and clinical experience. However, it's worth noting that this reliance on statistical methods might introduce its own problems, and at best these kinds of statistical analysis can only show associations between crime scene actions and offender characteristics. And these associations will never be perfect. I mean, there's always a possibility that your particular offender is an exception, a statistical outlier, if you like, to the general pattern of associations seen in that type of case. However, investigative psychology does suggest a more systematic approach to working out the characteristics of the offender. So while David Cantor is most well known for profiling John Duffy, the so-called railway rapist, since then investigative psychology has grown as a subdiscipline. Now, those working in investigative psychology are interested in patterns of criminal behaviour more broadly, and they can help investigators deal with a range of crimes.